Do you know the carbon footprint of your wardrobe? There's now a way to find out online, but is that really the right question that we need to be asking if we want to make the fashion industry more sustainable? Hello and welcome to the Green Stocking Society. My name is Shara, I work in sustainable fashion and I have a degree in philosophy, which means I basically just spent the whole of my masters overthinking. And recently I did a video where I analysed the last 2 years of my consumption habits and what I gained into my wardrobe. I ended up counting 62 new items, and around the same time a colleague of mine was kind enough to send me an article from Vogue that was detailing this new fashion footprint calculator that's been brought out by the thrifting platform thredUP in association with the third-party life cycle assessment specialists Green Story Inc. I was intrigued. This new calculator gives you 10 questions to answer about your consumption habits in the last year. Then it compares your data to findings from their customer behaviour surveys, as well as other peer-reviewed studies. I thought this was the perfect opportunity to feed all of that information that I collected from my previous video into this calculator and see what results we get, and I thought I'd take you along for the journey with me. I can already see that this is going to be very much so focused on individual consumption and individual responsibility when it comes to changing the way that the fashion industry works to make it more sustainable. So I can already see that there's going to be a few things that we're going to need to talk about along the way, but more on that later. Let's get into the calculations. So the first question is, how often do you buy clothing? And in their explainer article that goes along with this calculator, they also say that the average for a woman in the US is 41 apparel shopping trips in a year. Interesting that we're focusing here on women. I've done another video about something related to this, so if you're interested in that, check it out up here. But anyway, I'm gonna put about once per month. I like that it has these little informational bits at the bottom of each question. This one says, the number of garments produced each year has doubled since 2000 to about 100 billion and is on track to triple by 2050. 100 billion! My god. They're really jumping in there with the scale of the problem. Question 2 is, how many items of clothing do you buy in a year? So I did these calculations for my previous video, so I'm just going to put the numbers in and just half them. On this slide, they draw attention to the fact that different items have different impacts. Most jeans have 3 times the carbon impact of a t-shirt based on the weight of the fabric required. That makes sense. Question 3 is, how do you purchase your clothing? Again, this is something that I worked out in the previous video, so 68% of my clothing has been purchased online, and I don't think I ever really go for express shipping. In this little information bit, they say shopping online has a 79% lower carbon impact than shopping in store because of the car that you take to get to the store, which makes sense. But they also say that you can reduce your carbon emissions by 50% by opting for standard shipping rather than express shipping if you're shopping online. That's not really something that I've come across before, so that's good to know. I think there is a little bit of nuance required there though, because I know that some delivery courier services are actually carbon neutral. Also, this is an interesting question because most fast fashion brands tend to be on the high street in their physical stores, whereas especially newer sustainable brands tend to be online only and not have a physical store. I think that helps them to reduce their overhead costs, which means that they can price their items a little bit lower, which helps with accessibility because sustainable shopping can be a little bit more expensive. So that's probably another nuance that we'd want to consider for that question. Question 4 is, what percentage of your clothing purchases do you return? I don't think I ever really return many, maybe a couple of exchanges. Here it says, bummer alert, shopping online also results in more returns and gives you tips to shop with intention. That's great, and in their explainer article they also say that 25% of clothing that is returned actually ends up in landfill or is never resold, so that's why they penalise you in these calculations if you return a lot of your clothing. Question 5 is, what percentage of your clothes are second hand? I also worked this out previously and it came to 52%, which I was actually very pleased with. I was impressed with myself for that. At the bottom here they say, buying and wearing second-hand clothes instead of new reduces carbon emissions by an average of 25%. I think this is a little bit more complicated than it's making out here, because my first question would be, what is the material? We'll come back to that. Question 6 is, how many loads of laundry do you do per month? We do about 3 loads a week, so I guess that's 12 loads a month. I do want to get into the habit of spot cleaning more when that's more appropriate, so for like stains and little things like that where the whole item doesn't need to go in the wash, which is something that thredUP suggest here as well underneath the question. Then question 7 is tell us about your laundry habits. We always wash cold and air dry our clothes. Apparently 75% of laundry's carbon footprint comes from machine drying your clothes. Question 8 is how many items do you dry clean per month? And that for us is 0. I don't know if this is the same for anyone else, let me know, but I kind of consider dry cleaning as something that is just done in like American films. I don't think I would ever dry clean something unless it was like a wedding dress. And here it actually says that dry clean only usually means you can wash it gently by hand. On the page where they go into the details of the calculations, they mention that the type of solvent that's used in dry cleaning can also help to reduce the environmental impact of if you are dry cleaning your clothes. And again, that's something that will also apply for like laundry in general. So for example, we use plastic-free zero waste small laundry tablets. I'll leave a link to those below if you want to check those out. Question 9 is how many items do you repair each year? I think I do a few like little bits, little holes like socks and things like that, so I'm gonna put a few. Green Story says that repairing an item will increase its lifespan by 40%. Question 10 is how do you dispose of your clothing? This is such an important one. I think I am gonna have to put a small percentage as going in the bin, where it's like tiny things like socks that have like holes that are beyond repair. They say underneath this one that 1 in 2 people throw their unwanted clothes straight in the trash. That turns out to be about 36 billion items thrown in the trash every year. That's so true. It's such a massive issue. 1 dump truck of textile waste is burned or buried every single second, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And this is something that most brands don't think about at all, because all they care about is selling you the clothes, and once you have the clothes then it's your responsibility what you do with them. But really they also need to be taking responsibility for how they handle the end of life of those products, whether they can be sent back, what they promote in terms of recycling options. Cool, we made it to the end. Let's see what we get. So my impact is fairly low. My footprint is 42% lower than average, emitting 941 pounds of CO2 annually. That's 1,026 miles in a car. Then they've given me a little chart of the things that reduce your footprint the most and 12 ways to transform my sustainable fashion journey. Those are some really great resources. So overall, there's a lot of information packed into this little calculator, which I think is so great. It's definitely a great educational tool, but with so many things in sustainability, everything is so nuanced and complex that there's going to be things that this calculator and the little informational bits are not going to be able to cover. So let's see if we can close up some of those gaps. One of the biggest things I'm noticing is that there's a real focus in these questions on quantity over quality. So it asks you questions like how many items do you buy and how many do you buy second hand, but for example it doesn't ask you about the materials that are used in those clothes, which make a massive difference. It also, perhaps unsurprisingly, doesn't encourage you to shop from small, independent, sustainable brands. Of course, it's been made by thredUP and they are a resale, like thrifting platform. So obviously they are encouraging people to shop secondhand, which is great, but there is a lot to be said for smaller brands that are emerging that are doing a lot to try and tackle the fashion industry and do things differently, that are living wage employers, they are carbon neutral or they're B Corps. So I think there's a lot to be said for supporting those, which also often ties into like supporting local and supporting small and independent businesses. And that relates to point 3, which is where is ethics in all of this? Sustainable fashion has to consider ethical production at some point and the working conditions that garment workers are working in and things like that, which doesn't seem to be covered by this calculator at all in any form. Then there's also, of course, tied into that transparency around the supply chains that brands are using, which is again another thing that's not really mentioned. A related point is circularity. So reselling can extend the life of a product and keep it in circulation, which is great, but ultimately we need to think about where that product is going to end up, and that can't really be the individual's responsibility. So the individual can choose to buy from brands that have a circular initiative, or they can choose to buy materials that are easier to recycle. But ultimately, I think it's on the brands to develop those circularity initiatives and take responsibility for the whole life cycle of their product. So I'd like to see circularity mentioned or highlighted more as a proper solution for where things go when we're done with them. The final and probably most important thing that this calculator really brings up is this debate between individual consumption versus systemic change in the fashion industry. So what you on an individual level do and the choices that you make versus how brands behave, how companies behave, legislation that's put in place, and how the system works institutionally. This whole calculator thing is just about you. It's about your impact. And whilst there is a lot to be said for you voting with your wallet, that can't be the entire thing. That is not going to be how we actually change the fashion industry and change business as usual within the fashion industry and what that looks like. Often when companies and governments are trying to get you to focus internally on what you're doing individually, it's because they're trying to distract you and keep you ignorant about those things so that you don't actually turn it on them and ask them to change. Plus, often the solution for improving your individual consumption don't actually exist yet, or they're quite inaccessible. For example, in terms of price, because sustainable products do tend to be pricier even if they are secondhand, or in terms of sizing, because to find sustainable plus size clothing is really difficult. And so signing petitions and supporting organisations like Fashion Revolution or Labour Behind the Label and getting involved with that collective action can be a great way to maximise your impact and the things that you can influence individually. It's kind of funny because you get to the end of the calculations and you get your little report and you get your number and you look at your, your CO2 emissions and you think, okay, but how much of that could have actually been reduced by the brands that I'm buying from in their own supply chain before it kind of gets to me at all? So they could be going carbon neutral, using renewable energy, they could be taking care to consider the end of life of a product, they could be putting circular initiatives in place to reduce the overall impact of the product so that by the time that it gets to me, it's actually much lower because of things that they've put into place, because they've been responsible about their production and their impact on the planet and their impact on the people making their clothes. Interesting. Ultimately, the things that suppliers, brands, and manufacturers can do on their end will have a much bigger impact on your individual carbon fashion footprint than any of the choices that you could make deciding between what are basically a bunch of inadequate options.